The latch clicked with a finality that surprised me. My palm still pressed against the cool wood of the door, and for a moment, I couldn't quite believe I had done it. Closed the door. On my own son. You're just free babysitting anyway, his voice echoed in the sudden quiet of my hallway. The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and stinging, seeping into the grain of the wood, the weave of the hallway runner, the very walls that had sheltered 3 generations of our family. But now, with the door between us, something else filled the space. Silence. And in that silence, I found something I hadn't felt in years: sanctuary. My hand slipped from the doorknob to the deadbolt. The metal was warm under my fingers, worn smooth by decades of my turning it. How many times had I unlocked this door for him? How many times had I opened it wide, arms ready, schedule cleared, life rearranged? The small brass key felt heavy in my palm as I turned it. The tumbler fell into place with a soft thud that seemed to echo through my chest, reverberating in spaces I had forgotten existed. The hallway stretched before me, familiar yet somehow different. The same framed photographs lined the walls: graduations, weddings, grandchildren's first steps, but tonight they felt like artifacts from someone else's life. Someone who said yes to everything, who opened doors before anyone knocked, who measured her worth in how much she could give until there was nothing left to measure. I walked to my kitchen, my slippers whispering against the hardwood floors that David's father had installed 43 years ago. The sink held the remnants of an afternoon's babysitting: plastic cups with cartoon characters grinning up at me, crumb-scattered plates with the sticky residue of peanut butter sandwiches, a sippy cup that would need to be washed and returned. But not tonight. Tonight, I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the blue flame catching with a gentle whoosh that seemed to announce the beginning of something. Outside, the rain gathered strength, drumming against the window above the sink with increasing insistence. I watched the water streak down the glass, distorting the streetlights into soft halos, blurring the edges of a world that had suddenly become negotiable. The familiar landscape of my neighborhood wavered behind the rain, as if even geography had become uncertain, open to revision. Dignity has a sound. It is the latch of a door, well closed. The words came to me unbidden, settling into my consciousness with the weight of truth. I pressed my palm against the cool glass of the window and watched my breath fog the surface momentarily before clearing. How long had it been since I had stood still long enough to fog a window with my own breathing? How long since I had the luxury of watching rain without calculating whether it would complicate pickup and drop-off schedules, whether little Emma would need her raincoat, whether the playground would be too wet for an afternoon outing that would tire her enough for an early bedtime? The kettle began its gradual build toward boiling, the water inside shifting from silence to whisper to murmur. I pulled my favorite mug from the cabinet, the blue one with the chip on the handle that I had kept despite Sarah's hints that I should invest in a matching set for when company came. But tonight, company felt like the last thing I wanted. Tonight, I wanted the familiar weight of this imperfect mug in my hands, the knowledge that I could drink my tea as hot or as cool as I preferred, with as much honey as pleased me, without anyone commenting on my choices. Steam began to curl from the kettle spout, and I thought about steam in general, how it was just water transformed by heat, how pressure could change the very essence of a thing without changing its fundamental nature. I was still David's mother, still Emma's grandmother, still the woman who had spent decades nurturing and protecting and providing. But perhaps, like steam, I could maintain my essential self while taking an entirely different form. The kettle's whistle started low and built to a crescendo that filled my kitchen with urgency. I turned off the flame and poured the boiling water over the chamomile tea bag, watching the golden color bloom through the clear water like a sunrise spreading across a horizon. The scent rose with the steam, apple sweet, hay warm, utterly peaceful. As I waited for the tea to steep, I found myself cataloging the sounds of my house when it belonged only to me. The grandfather clock in the living room marked time with steady authority. The refrigerator's gentle hum. The rain against multiple windows creates a symphony of different pitches and rhythms. The house itself seemed to exhale, settling into its bones the way I was settling into mine. I carried my tea to the kitchen table and sat in the chair that faced the window, The one I rarely chose when Emma was here because it put my back to the room where a curious 3-year-old might get into anything. But tonight, I could turn my back on the room because there was nothing in it that required my vigilance, nothing that could break or spill or require immediate attention. The tea was perfect, hot enough to warm me from the inside out, mild enough to soothe rather than stimulate. I cupped the mug in both hands and let the steam warm my face while I tried to understand what had just happened and what would happen next. 7 days. That's what I had, I realized. 7 days before the full implications of tonight's choice would ripple out into every corner of my life. 7 days to either retreat into apology and accommodation, or to build something new on the foundation of that closed door. 7 days can redraw 70 years. I could see it all unfolding before me like a film reel. The morning I would walk into the bank and ask them to remove David and Sarah's names from my accounts. In the afternoon, I would meet with a locksmith who would replace the hardware that had made my home accessible to anyone who felt entitled to enter. The evening I would pack a suitcase, not to flee, but to remember what it felt like to go somewhere simply because I wanted to be there. There would be phone calls. Conversations heavy with hurt and confusion and the weight of changed expectations. There would be pushback from people who had grown comfortable with my constant availability, who had mistaken my love for my lack of boundaries, who had confused my devotion with their right to my time. But there would also be other things. A lawyer's office where I would sign papers that protected my autonomy and reflected my values. A garden where I would plant flowers chosen for their beauty rather than their practicality. A kitchen where I would bake bread at 3 in the afternoon simply because I wanted to smell yeast and flour transforming into something nourishing. I would discover the weight of new keys in my purse, the satisfaction of a bank account that reflected only my own decisions, the particular peace that came from sleeping in a house where no one could enter without my explicit invitation. I would learn the difference between being needed and being used, between being loved and being convenient. By the time 7 days had passed, I would understand that the woman who closed the door tonight was not the same woman who would open it next week. I would open it on my own terms, for people who had earned the privilege of my welcome, at times that honored both their needs and my boundaries. The tea had cooled to the perfect drinking temperature, and I took my first real sip, not the hurried gulps between tending to Emma's needs, not the lukewarm dregs discovered hours later and microwaved back to life, but a deliberate, present moment of warmth and flavor and choice. It tasted like possibility. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against my windows, washing the day clean and preparing the ground for whatever would grow from the seeds I was about to plant. I finished my tea slowly, savoring each sip, and when the mug was empty, I rinsed it carefully and placed it in the drainer to dry. Tomorrow, I will begin. Tonight, I would simply be a woman in her own kitchen, accountable to no one but herself, with 7 days to remember who she was and 7 more to decide who she wanted to become. The grandfather clock chimed 11, and I turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the soft glow from the street lamp outside to illuminate my path to bed. I had nowhere to be in the morning except exactly where I was, no one to please except myself, no schedule to maintain except the one I chose to create. It felt like freedom. It felt like coming home. When I woke the next morning, the events of the previous evening felt both dreamlike and more real than anything I had experienced in years. Sunlight streamed through my bedroom windows, painting geometric patterns on the hardwood floor, and for the first time in decades, I had nowhere to be at any particular time. The absence of obligation was initially disorienting. My body wanted to spring into its familiar routine, quick shower, hasty breakfast, preparation for Emma's arrival. But Emma wouldn't be arriving today. Or tomorrow. Or any day until I decided that she could, under circumstances that honored both my love for her and my need for autonomy. I lay in bed for an extra 30 minutes, watching the play of light and shadow on my ceiling, listening to the morning sounds of my neighborhood without the urgency that usually accompanied them. Dogs barking, cars starting, the distant hum of the garbage truck making its weekly rounds. All of it happening around me, none of it requiring my immediate attention or response. When I finally rose, I moved through my morning routine with deliberate slowness. I brewed coffee in my good china cup instead of the travel mug that had become my constant companion. I toasted bread and ate it with real butter and strawberry jam, tasting each bite instead of wolfing it down between tasks. I read 3 chapters of a novel that had been bookmarked at page 47 for 6 months. The phone rang at 9:15. Sarah's number is on the caller ID. I watched it ring 4 times before the answering machine picked up, listened to her bright, expectant voice leaving a message about confirming today's babysitting arrangement, heard the slight edge of confusion when I didn't answer. The second call came at 9:45. David, this time, his voice carrying the particular blend of concern and irritation that I had been managing for years. Mom, Sarah says you're not answering your phone. Are you okay? Emma's ready to come over whenever you are. I sipped my coffee and made no move toward the phone. The machine would collect their messages, and I would decide later whether and when to respond. For now, the sound of my own breathing was more interesting than the sound of other people's expectations. The third call came at 10:30. This time I answered, but only because I recognized Margaret's number and knew she would worry if she couldn't reach me. Helen? Thank goodness. I was starting to imagine all sorts of terrible things. Good morning, Margaret. I'm perfectly fine. Oh, well, that's wonderful. I was calling to see if you wanted to join me for lunch at that new cafe downtown. I know Tuesdays are usually your Emma days, but I thought perhaps. I'd love to, I said, surprising both of us with the speed of my response. What time? When I hung up, I realized I had just made my first independent social plan in months. Lunch with my oldest friend, chosen spontaneously, requiring no childcare arrangements or schedule coordination. The simplicity of it felt revolutionary. But first, I had work to do. I pulled out a legal pad and pen, settling at my kitchen table with the purposefulness of someone drafting important documents. At the top of the page, I wrote, "Things that will change." The list began to flow. Bank accounts, remove David and Sarah's access. House keys, new locks, my control only. Availability for babysitting, by invitation only, with advance notice. Financial decisions, no consultation required or welcomed. Social plans, made according to my preferences and schedule. Household access, earned, not assumed. Emergency contact, still available for true emergencies, not convenience. Each item felt like a small rebellion, a quiet revolution against decades of accommodation. I was not rejecting my family, I realized, but rather insisting that they treat me like family instead of like hired help. The distinction was crucial, and writing it down made it real. The fourth phone call came as I was getting dressed for lunch. David again, his voice sharper now, tinged with the frustration of someone whose expectations were being thwarted. Mom, I don't know what's going on, but Sarah is scrambling to find childcare, and Emma is asking for you. This isn't like you to just disappear without explanation. I listened to the entire message before picking up the phone. When I did, my voice was calm, measured, and entirely my own. Hello, David. Mom, thank God. What's happening? Why aren't you answering your phone? Why didn't Emma come over today? I'm having lunch with Margaret this afternoon, I said, as if this explained everything. In a way, it did. But what about Emma? Sarah had to call in sick to work because she couldn't find anyone to watch her. That sounds challenging for Sarah. Mom, seriously. What's gotten into you? You always watch Emma on Tuesdays. The smallest noise is louder than years of silence. I always have, I said carefully. But that was never a contract, David. It was a gift that I gave freely. Gifts can be given or withheld depending on the circumstances. Circumstances? What circumstances? What are you talking about? I thought about his words from the night before, the casual dismissal that had reduced years of devoted grandmothering to free babysitting. I thought about the assumption that my time belonged to him, that my schedule existed for his convenience, that my love could be measured by my willingness to be taken for granted. I'm talking about respect, David. I'm talking about gratitude. I'm talking about treating me like a person rather than a service. The silence on the other end stretched long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat, to notice the way the sunlight had shifted since I started this conversation, to realize that I felt calmer now than I had in months. I don't understand what you mean. I know you don't. But you will. I hung up gently, not with anger but with finality. Then I finished getting dressed for lunch, choosing my blue sweater, the one that Sarah always said was too bright for someone my age, and my good pearls, the ones that had belonged to David's grandmother and made me feel connected to a long line of women who had loved fiercely and demanded respect. The cafe was everything Margaret had promised: warm lighting, comfortable chairs, and servers who treated customers like welcome guests rather than sources of tips. We ordered soup and sandwiches and spent 2 hours catching up on everything except my family drama, though I could tell Margaret sensed something had shifted in my universe. You look different today, she said as we shared a piece of lemon cake. Rested. More. Present, somehow. I closed a door last night, I told her. And I'm discovering what opens when other things close. She nodded as if this made perfect sense, and perhaps it did. Margaret had buried one husband and divorced another, raised 3 children, and seen them through their own divorces and remarriages and career changes. She understood that life was a series of endings and beginnings, that sometimes the most courageous thing you could do was stop doing what you had always done. By the time I returned home that afternoon, there were 6 messages on my answering machine. 3 from Sarah, 2 from David, and 1 from David's sister Jennifer, who lived 2 states away but had apparently been recruited to talk sense into me. I listened to all of them while brewing a pot of tea, noting the progression from confusion to frustration to barely controlled panic. None of them asked how I was feeling. None of them expressed curiosity about my needs or desires. All of them focused on the disruption my choices had caused to their plans, their expectations, their comfort with the status quo. I deleted the messages without returning any of the calls. Tomorrow, I will begin the practical work of rebuilding my life. Tonight, I would simply enjoy the taste of lemon cake lingering on my tongue and the satisfaction of a day spent entirely in my own company. The grandfather clock chimed 6, and I realized I was hungry for dinner, not for the hasty sandwich eaten while supervising a toddler's meal, but for food chosen and prepared and consumed with attention and pleasure. I pulled ingredients from my refrigerator and began to cook for an audience of 1, seasoning everything to my exact preferences, taking as much time as I wanted, cleaning as I went because I could, because the kitchen was mine and the evening was mine and the pleasure of nourishing myself was mine to claim. Thursday morning brought resolution in the form of action. I dressed carefully, not for anyone else's approval, but for my own sense of dignity and purpose, and drove to the bank that had held my accounts for 37 years. The parking lot was nearly empty at 10 o'clock on a weekday morning, the kind of time when people my age were supposed to be available for babysitting, for emergencies, for the convenience of others. Instead, I was here to reclaim my financial autonomy from people who had confused my generosity with their entitlement. The lobby smelled like floor wax and fresh coffee, institutional but somehow reassuring. I had done business here long enough to remember when the tellers knew every customer by name, when transactions were recorded by hand in ledgers, when a person's word and signature carried weight that couldn't be disputed or overridden. Mrs. Patterson. The young woman behind the customer service desk looked up with professional brightness. How can I help you today? I need to make some changes to my accounts, I said, settling into the chair across from her desk. I want to remove some authorized users. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. I see you have David Patterson and Sarah Patterson as signatories on your checking account, and David Patterson on your savings account. You'd like to remove both of them? Yes. May I ask the reason for this change? I considered several possible answers: the truth about being called free babysitting, the frustration with decades of assumed availability, the simple desire to control my own money. Instead, I said simply, I no longer require their assistance with my financial affairs. The paperwork was more extensive than I had expected, requiring signatures and initials, identity verification, and security questions. But with each form I completed, something loosened in my chest. These were my accounts, funded by my late husband's pension and my own careful savings, intended to provide security for my retirement and dignity for my final years. No one else's name belonged on them unless I specifically invited them there. The changes will take effect immediately, the young woman explained, handing me copies of all the documents. The old signature cards will be destroyed, and new ones will be created with only your authorization. I thanked her and walked back to my car, carrying a manila folder that contained proof of my financial independence. The weight of it felt significant, like carrying a deed to my own life. From the bank, I drove to the locksmith's shop that Margaret had recommended after her own divorce. The owner was a man in his 60s with gentle hands and kind eyes who asked no questions about why a woman my age needed new locks on a Thursday afternoon. "How many keys would you like?" he asked, holding up the bright brass copies he had just cut. For 30 years, there had been multiple copies scattered among family members, insurance against my ever being unreachable, unavailable, or inconvenient to access. Keys to ensure that others could enter my space whenever they deemed it necessary, regardless of my wishes or boundaries. "Just 2, I said. "Both for me." I drove home with new keys in my purse and a receipt for installation the following morning. Tomorrow, my house would be mine in a way it hadn't been since David was old enough to have his own key, since I had mistaken preparing my children for independence with surrendering my own privacy. The afternoon brought another round of phone calls, increasingly frustrated, increasingly focused on the inconvenience my choices were causing everyone except me. I let them all go to the machine, listening to the messages while I prepared a simple dinner of soup and bread, noting how the tone shifted from confusion to concern to barely contained anger. By evening, I had a plan. Not just for tomorrow. The locksmith would come at 9, I would meet with Margaret for coffee at 11, I would spend the afternoon reading in my garden, but for the days and weeks and months to come. I would rebuild my life one choice at a time, one boundary at a time, one moment of self-respect at a time. That night, I called my sister Patricia in Phoenix. We hadn't spoken in months because my schedule had been too full of other people's needs to make time for my own relationships. "Helen? Is everything all right? You sound different." "I sound like myself," I said. "And everything is finally all right." Friday afternoon found me sitting in the law office that Margaret had recommended, trying to explain to Mrs. Brennan, the estate attorney, what I wanted to accomplish without revealing too much about the family dynamics that had brought me here. "I want to establish a trust," I said, "that reflects my values and protects my autonomy. I want to ensure that my financial decisions remain mine for as long as I'm mentally competent, and that after my death, my assets support causes I believe in." Mrs. Brennan was younger than I had expected, but she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had helped many people navigate the complex intersection of money and family relationships. Her office was warm and professional, lined with law books and family photographs that suggested she understood both the legal and personal dimensions of what we were discussing. "Have there been any challenges to your financial autonomy recently?" she asked, her pen poised over a legal pad. I thought about David's assumption that he could demand explanations for changes to my own bank accounts, about the casual way he and Sarah had treated my resources as extensions of their own convenience. Let's say I'd become newly aware of the importance of maintaining clear boundaries around my assets. Fictional narrative. Not legal/financial advice. The conversation that followed was both technical and deeply personal. We discussed trust structures and distribution strategies, beneficiary designations, and successor trustees. Mrs. Brennan explained various options for protecting assets while maintaining flexibility, always careful to emphasize that she was providing information for my consideration, not specific recommendations for my situation. "I'd like to include a charitable component," I said as we neared the end of our initial consultation. Something that supports programs for elder dignity, organizations that help older adults maintain independence and choice in their living situations. Mrs. Brennan smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she had allowed herself during our professional discussion. That's a beautiful way to ensure your values outlive you. We scheduled a follow-up appointment for the following week to review the draft documents she would prepare. As I left her office, I felt the weight of another significant decision made and documented. The trust would protect a portion of my savings for causes I believed in while ensuring I retained complete control over my daily finances for as long as I remained mentally competent. No one could override my decisions. No one could claim authority over my choices. No one could dismiss my autonomy as mere stubbornness or confusion. Order is also a kind of love. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and began drafting letters. Not of explanation or apology, but of clarification. I would mail them on Monday, after the weekend gives me time to refine their tone and content. These letters would establish the new terms of my relationships with David and Sarah, the boundaries within which our future interactions would occur. The words came slowly at first, then with increasing clarity. Dear David, I am writing to clarify some changes in my availability and expectations. These changes reflect my need to balance my love for you and your family with my responsibility to maintain my own well-being and autonomy. Going forward, I will be happy to spend time with Emma when we have made advance arrangements that work for both of our schedules. I will no longer be available for last-minute childcare requests or for regular weekly commitments that prevent me from making my own plans. I have made some changes to my financial accounts and home security that reflect my need to maintain control over my own resources and living space. These changes are not a reflection of decreased trust or love, but rather an assertion of boundaries that should have been in place all along. I hope you can understand that these changes will ultimately strengthen our relationship by ensuring that the time and help I provide come from choice rather than obligation. With love, Mom. The letter to Sarah was similar but more direct, addressing the specific patterns that had developed around childcare expectations and household access. I wrote and rewrote both letters, seeking the tone that balanced firmness with affection, clarity with kindness. By the time I finished, the kitchen clock showed nearly midnight. I sealed both letters in envelopes and placed them on the counter where I would see them first thing in the morning. Monday, I would mail them. Monday, I would make my new boundaries explicit and undeniable. But first, I had a weekend to enjoy in my newly reclaimed house, with my newly changed locks, accountable to no one but myself. Saturday morning brought unexpected grace in the form of my neighbor Eleanor, who appeared at my back door with a thermos of coffee and a plate of her famous cinnamon rolls. She was 73, a widow who had spent the past 5 years since Harold's death learning to live life on her own terms, and she had clearly sensed that something significant was shifting in my world. Rough week? She asked, settling into the chair across from me with the ease of someone who had been welcomed into my kitchen many times over the past 5 years. Changing week, I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. The warmth spread through my hands, and I inhaled the rich aroma. Eleanor's coffee was always perfect, strong enough to wake the dead, smooth enough to comfort any anxiety. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the morning light filter through my kitchen windows. Eleanor had a gift for presence without pressure, for offering support without demanding explanations. At 73, she was older than me in years but somehow younger in spirit, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from having weathered life's storms and emerged with her sense of self intact. You know, she said eventually, breaking off a piece of cinnamon roll, when Harold died, everyone expected me to sell the house. Too big for one person, they said. Too much work, too many memories. My daughter kept bringing me brochures for senior communities. I nodded, understanding instinctively where this story was heading. Eleanor's house was indeed large, a rambling Victorian with a wraparound porch and gardens that she tended with fierce devotion. But I realized something important, she continued. The house wasn't too big for me. Everyone else's expectations were too small for who I wanted to become. She gestured toward my kitchen window, where I could see her garden in the distance, already showing the bright green shoots of early spring. Last year I planted marigolds for the first time. Harold always said they were too common, too bright, too cheerful for our sophisticated landscape. But you know what I discovered? I love how they don't apologize for their color, how they bloom regardless of what anyone thinks they should be. Sometimes roots are neighbors. David thinks I've lost my mind, I said, surprising myself with the admission. Have you? I think I've found it again. Eleanor laughed, a sound like wind chimes on a gentle breeze. Oh, honey, the people who benefit most from our accommodations are always the first to call us crazy when we stop providing them. We talked for 3 hours that morning, sharing stories and strategies, fears and small victories. Eleanor had navigated her own version of this journey, learning to disappoint adult children who expected her to live smaller so they could worry less. She had refused to move closer to her daughter, chosen to travel solo to Scotland at age 71, and started taking pottery classes that left clay under her fingernails and joy in her voice. The secret, she told me as she prepared to leave, is to remember that disappointing others is sometimes the kindest thing you can do. For them and for yourself. When you stop enabling their dependence, you force them to discover their own strength. That afternoon, I called a travel agent, not for anything elaborate or adventurous, but for something manageable and entirely mine. I wanted to take a trip, just a weekend away, to a place where no one knew me as anyone's mother or grandmother, where I could simply be myself without the weight of decades of accumulated expectations. A solo trip? The agent asked, and I heard the slight surprise in her voice. Just for me, I confirmed. How wonderful, she said, and suddenly it was. We settled on a small inn in the mountains, a place that advertised quiet rooms and good books and meals served on real china. Nothing exotic or demanding, just a change of scenery that would allow me to practice being accountable only to myself. I made the reservation for the following weekend, giving myself a full week to adjust to my new locks and new banking arrangements before testing my independence in unfamiliar territory. The confirmation email felt like a promise, proof that I could still make spontaneous decisions and follow through on them. That evening, I began packing for the trip, choosing clothes for comfort rather than appropriateness, books I wanted to read rather than ones I thought I should finish. My Goodwill coat went into the suitcase first, followed by the cashmere scarf my sister had given me for Christmas 3 years ago, still in its box, still waiting for a special occasion that I had never quite managed to create. The suitcase sat at the foot of my bed like a declaration of independence. Tomorrow I would carry it to my car and drive 3 hours into the mountains, where I would spend 3 days responsible for no one but myself. I would eat when I was hungry, sleep when I was tired, and speak only when I had something to say. A suitcase can be rebellion, zipped. Sunday evening, I left a note on my dresser, brief and clear, gone for a few days. Back on Wednesday evening. Mom. No apologies, no detailed itinerary, no emergency contact information beyond my cell phone number. Just the facts, delivered with the confidence of someone who owed no explanations for her own choices. The drive to the mountains on Monday morning was a revelation in itself. For 3 hours, I was accountable to no one but myself and the rhythm of the road. I stopped when I wanted to stop, drove as fast or as slowly as I felt comfortable, and played music that pleased me without considering anyone else's preferences. The countryside rolled past my windows in shades of green and gold, early spring asserting itself in tentative blossoms and fresh leaves. I found myself noticing details I had missed for years, the way morning mist clung to valleys, the patterns hawks made as they circled overhead, the particular quality of light that filtered through new leaves. Somewhere outside a small mountain town, I pulled over at a roadside farm stand and bought fresh strawberries and local honey, eating the berries straight from the basket while sitting on a picnic table, my legs swinging like a child's. The sweetness burst across my tongue, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I had eaten something simply because it looked delicious, without considering whether anyone else would want some, whether it was nutritious enough, or whether it was worth the calories. The inn was everything the brochure had promised and more, a white farmhouse perched on a hillside, surrounded by gardens just beginning to show their spring colors. My room was small and perfect, with a reading chair positioned by the window and a view of mountains that seemed to stretch into forever. For 3 days, I did exactly what I wanted, when I wanted to do it. I read an entire novel in one sitting, curled up in the window chair while afternoon light moved across the pages. I took a bath at 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon simply because I could, adding lavender salts that turned the water cloudy and filled the bathroom with the scent of summer. I ordered room service breakfast on Wednesday morning and ate it in bed while watching the sunrise paint the mountains pink and gold. On Tuesday evening, I found myself in conversation with another solo traveler in the inn's small dining room, a woman about my age who was celebrating her first year of retirement by visiting every state park in North Carolina. "My family thinks I'm having some kind of crisis," she told me over dinner, her eyes bright with the particular excitement of someone who had discovered late in life that she was more interesting than she had given herself credit for. "A midlife crisis at 72, they say." "Better late than never," I replied, and we both laughed until our sides hurt. She told me about her travels, about sleeping in a tent for the first time since Girl Scout camp, about learning to read topographical maps and identify bird calls, and about building campfires. I told her about my new locks, my trust documents, and my decision to stop being anyone's free anything. "Good for you," she said, raising her wine glass in a toast. "Here's to women who refuse to make themselves smaller to make others more comfortable." The window fogs, but the view clears. By the time I checked out Wednesday afternoon, I felt like a different person, not transformed exactly, but remembered. As if I had spent 3 days reacquainting myself with someone I used to know quite well, someone who had opinions about things, who could sit quietly without feeling guilty, who took up space in the world without apologizing for it. The drive home felt different from the departure. Instead of leaving something behind, I was bringing something back: confidence, clarity, and the unshakable knowledge that I could take care of myself quite well when given the opportunity. The mountains in my rearview mirror seemed to approve of my journey, blessing my return with afternoon light that made everything look possible. I pulled into my driveway just as the sun was setting, painting my house in shades of gold and amber. The new locks gleamed on my front door, and the marigolds I had planted in my front garden were showing their first bright blooms. Everything looked exactly as I had left it, but I was seeing it all with eyes that had remembered what it meant to choose. Inside, my answering machine blinked with 17 messages. I ignored it completely, unpacking my suitcase slowly, savoring the memory of each item's role in my independence. The cashmere scarf still smelled faintly of mountain air and possibility. The wool coat had earned its place in my wardrobe by keeping me warm during my solo walks through unfamiliar gardens. That evening, I made myself a simple dinner of soup and bread, eating it slowly while watching the last light fade from my garden. Tomorrow would bring the practical work of reinforcing the boundaries I had established, of following through on the promises I had made to myself. But tonight, I simply existed in the peaceful space I had created, accountable to no one but myself, responsible for nothing but my own contentment. When the phone rang at 9 o'clock, I answered it because I wanted to, not because I felt obligated to. "Mom?" David's voice carried relief and frustration in equal measure. "Thank God you're home. We've been worried sick." "Where have you been?" "I took a trip," I said simply. "A trip? What kind of trip? Where? Why didn't you tell anyone?" "I told you in the note I left. I went to the mountains for a few days." "By yourself?" "By myself." The silence that followed contained multitudes, disbelief, concern, and the dawning realization that I was no longer the predictable, available person he had always known me to be. "Mom, are you sure you're okay? This isn't like you." "You're right," I said. "It's exactly like me. You just haven't seen this part of me in a very long time." Thursday morning, I had an appointment that would change everything. Not dramatically, not with fanfare or confrontation, but with the quiet authority of ink on paper and intentions made legally binding. Mrs. Brennan's office felt different this second time, less intimidating, more like a place where important business was conducted between equals. She had prepared the trust documents according to our discussions, and they lay on her desk like a map to my future independence. "I've incorporated all the provisions we discussed," she said, guiding me through the papers page by page. "The trust protects a significant portion of your assets for the charitable purposes you specified, while ensuring you maintain complete control over your daily financial needs for as long as you're mentally competent." Fictional narrative. Not legal/financial advice. I read each page carefully, understanding that these signatures would formalize what I had been feeling for weeks, that my money, my decisions, and my legacy belonged to me alone. No one could override my choices, no one could claim authority over my assets, no one could dismiss my autonomy as the whims of an aging woman who didn't understand her own best interests. The charitable component focuses on elder dignity programs, as you requested, Mrs. Brennan continued. Organizations that help older adults maintain independence, programs that support aging in place, and advocacy groups that protect elder rights. The distributions will begin immediately and continue after your death. Some signatures are wings. I signed my name 17 times that afternoon, each signature a small act of rebellion against decades of diminished expectations. These documents would ensure that my values outlived me, that my belief in elder dignity would continue to support others long after I was gone. More immediately, they would protect my right to make my own financial decisions without interference or second-guessing from family members who confused their concern with their entitlement. When the signing was complete, Mrs. Brennan handed me copies of everything, bound in a leather portfolio that felt both official and personal. "These documents represent your legal right to control your own life," she said. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." I carried the portfolio to my car like a shield, proof against anyone who might question my capacity or challenge my choices. The trust was established, the beneficiaries designated, and the charitable purposes legally protected. My autonomy was no longer a matter of family dynamics or personal strength, it was now a matter of law. That afternoon, I stopped at the grocery store and bought ingredients for bread, good flour, fresh yeast, and honey from local hives. Not because anyone expected me to bake, not because I needed to provide comfort food for visiting grandchildren, but because I wanted to fill my house with the smell of creation and nourishment. At home, I mixed the dough slowly, kneading it with attention and patience while Mozart played on the radio and late afternoon light slanted through my kitchen windows. The process was meditative, almost ceremonial. Flour and water and yeast transformed through heat and time into something sustaining and beautiful. While the bread rose, I wrote thank you notes to Eleanor for her coffee and wisdom, to Margaret for her friendship and restaurant recommendation, to the innkeeper who had made my solo retreat so peaceful. Each note was brief but heartfelt, acknowledging the support that had helped me reclaim my own life. The bread timer chimed just as the sun was setting, and I pulled 2 perfect loaves from the oven. Their crusts were golden and crackling, releasing steam that carried the scent of wheat and warmth throughout my kitchen. I made tea while they cooled, strong and sweet, the way I preferred it when no one else's taste needed consideration. The first slice was still warm when I cut it, the crumbs soft and yielding, perfect for spreading with real butter that melted into tiny golden pools. I carried my plate and cup to the front porch, settling into the wicker chair that faced my garden, where the marigolds Eleanor had inspired me to plant were now blooming in brilliant orange and yellow. Pieces of flavor, and tonight I taste it warm. A car drove slowly past my house as I sat there, and I recognized it as David's sedan. He slowed as he approached my driveway, and I could see him looking toward my porch, perhaps weighing whether to stop and try once again to demand explanations for my choices. But something about my posture, relaxed, unhurried, completely at home in my own space, must have communicated that I was not available for that conversation. He drove on without stopping. I finished my bread and tea as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, listening to the symphony of evening sounds that belonged to my neighborhood, dogs barking their dinner announcements, children being called inside, the distant sound of television programs beginning their nightly entertainment. All of it happening around me, none of it requiring my participation or response. When I went inside, I found 3 messages on my answering machine, 2 from David, 1 from Sarah, all requesting return calls to discuss the situation. I deleted them without listening to the complete messages, understanding that the situation was simply my refusal to continue being convenient rather than valued. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice the boundaries I had been building. There would be more conversations, more questions, more pressure to return to the accommodating patterns that had defined our relationships for years. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I chose to do, accountable to no one but myself. The trust documents lay on my dining room table, legal proof of my right to this peace. The bread cooling on my kitchen counter proved I could create beauty simply because I wanted to. The new locks on my doors guaranteed that this sanctuary remained mine to share or withhold as I saw fit. As I prepared for bed, I thought about doors in general, how they could shut people out or invite them in, how they could protect or imprison, how the same piece of wood could represent barriers or boundaries depending on who held the key. The door I had closed on David 3 weeks ago had been the beginning of everything, the moment when I stopped being available for disrespect and started being present for my own life. Tomorrow, I would open that same door, but only on my terms, only for people who had earned the privilege of my welcome. And if anyone knocked demanding explanations for my choices, they would discover that dignity had a sound after all. It sounded exactly like a door, well closed. The knock that came Friday afternoon was different, gentle, respectful, accompanied by the sound of a car door closing softly rather than slamming. I looked through the window and saw David standing on my porch, but his posture had changed. Instead of the aggressive stance of someone demanding entry, he stood with his hands at his sides, shoulders slightly hunched, looking more like the little boy who used to wait nervously outside my bedroom door when he'd had a nightmare. I opened the door partway, my hand remaining on the knob. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, David. I was wondering if we could talk. I mean, if you have time. If you're not busy." The careful politeness in his voice was new, and I recognized it as the first sign that my boundaries were being acknowledged, if not yet fully understood. I stepped back and opened the door wider, but I didn't invite him in immediately. "What would you like to talk about?" "About what's been happening. About why everything feels so different. About..." He paused, seeming to search for words that wouldn't sound accusatory or demanding. "About how to fix this." "Come in," I said, leading him to the living room rather than the kitchen, where we usually sat. The formality felt important, a signal that this was not going to be the kind of casual conversation where problems were smoothed over with coffee and cookies and my automatic accommodation. David sat on the edge of the sofa, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I chose the chair across from him, maintaining both physical and emotional distance while we navigated this new territory. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said on the phone. About respect and gratitude. And I think maybe I haven't been as thoughtful as I should have been." It wasn't a full apology, and it wasn't a complete acknowledgement of the patterns that had brought us to this point. But it was a beginning, the first crack in the wall of assumption and entitlement that had built up over years of my accommodating his family's needs at the expense of my own. "I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully. "But I want you to understand that this isn't about you being more thoughtful going forward. This is about rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than my availability." "I don't understand the difference." "The difference is that thoughtfulness suggests you'll try to be nicer while still expecting the same level of accommodation from me. Mutual respect means understanding that my time, my resources, and my energy are mine to share as I choose, not yours to assume or demand." We talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, working through the practical implications of my new boundaries. No more assumed babysitting arrangements. If they needed childcare, they would ask in advance and accept my response, whether it was yes or no. No more access to my house without explicit invitation. The new locks would stay, and they would need to call before coming over. No more involvement in my financial decisions. The bank accounts and trust documents were mine to manage without consultation or oversight. David struggled with each of these changes, not because he was malicious, but because he had never had to consider me as a separate person with my own needs and preferences. For years, I had been an extension of his family's convenience, so available and accommodating that my own autonomy had become invisible. "But what if there's an emergency?" he asked. "What if Emma needs you and you're not available? Then you'll handle the emergency the way other parents do, by solving the problem yourself or finding alternative resources. My love for Emma doesn't require me to be on call 24 hours a day. And what if you need something? What if something happens to you and we can't get in? Then you'll call emergency services or wait for me to invite you in when I'm able. My safety doesn't require you to have unlimited access to my home." Each answer seemed to surprise him, as if he had never considered that I might have legitimate reasons for wanting control over my own life. But gradually, I could see understanding beginning to dawn, not full acceptance yet, but recognition that this was not a phase or a tantrum, but a permanent restructuring of our relationship. When he left that afternoon, he hugged me at the door, carefully, respectfully, the way you embrace someone you're still learning to see as a separate person rather than an extension of your own needs. "I love you, Mom," he said. "I love you, too, David. That's why I'm doing this." After he left, I sat in my living room for a long time, processing the conversation and what it might mean for our future. It wasn't the dramatic reconciliation that movies might suggest, but it was something more valuable, the beginning of an adult relationship based on choice rather than obligation, respect rather than assumption. That evening, I called Emma directly for the first time in weeks. At 3 years old, she couldn't understand the complex family dynamics that had led to my absence, but she could understand that Grandma missed her and wanted to plan a special visit. "Grandma, where have you been?" "I've been taking care of myself, sweetheart. But I've missed you terribly. Would you like to come visit me next Saturday? We could bake cookies and read stories, and play in the garden." "Yes. Can I pick the cookies?" "Of course you can. It's your special visit." When Sarah came on the phone to arrange the details, her voice was careful, polite, stripped of the casual assumptions that had characterized our previous interactions. "Are you sure Saturday works for you? We don't want to impose." "Saturday works perfectly. I'm looking forward to it. Should I bring anything? Lunch for Emma, or snacks, or just Emma? I'll take care of everything else." It was a small exchange, but it represented a seismic shift in how they viewed my time and resources. For the first time in years, they were asking rather than assuming, requesting rather than demanding, treating me like someone whose preferences mattered rather than someone whose accommodation could be taken for granted. Saturday's visit with Emma was everything I had hoped it would be, 3 hours of pure grandmotherly joy without the weight of obligation or resentment. We baked sugar cookies shaped like flowers, read picture books while snuggled on the couch, and planted nasturtium seeds in small pots that she could take home and tend in her own garden. When Sarah came to pick her up, she lingered on my porch for a few minutes, seeming to search for words that would acknowledge the changes without directly addressing the conflict that had preceded them. "She's had such a wonderful time," Sarah said finally. "Thank you for making this special for her." "Thank you for trusting me with her afternoon," I replied, meaning it completely. It was a small step, but it felt significant, the first time in years that our interaction had been framed as mutual gift-giving rather than one-sided accommodation. Emma left with her flower cookies and seedling pots, and I was left with the satisfaction of time spent exactly as I had chosen to spend it. That evening, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and reflected on how far I had come in just 3 weeks. The marigolds Eleanor had inspired me to plant were now in full bloom, their bright faces turned toward the setting sun with the kind of unapologetic beauty that no longer seemed foreign to me. I had learned to bloom on my own terms, to claim space and light and nourishment without asking permission or making excuses. The phone rang as I was preparing for bed, and I almost didn't answer it. But something made me pick up, perhaps the intuition that this call would be different from the demanding, frustrated messages of the past few weeks. "Mom?" David's voice was soft, thoughtful. I just wanted to say thank you. For what? For not letting me treat you badly anymore. For caring enough about our relationship to insist that it be better. You're welcome, I said, surprised by the emotion in my own voice. Sarah and I have been talking, and we realize how much we've been taking you for granted. We want to do better. We want to be better. I'd like that too. Would you? Would you like to have dinner with us next week? A real dinner, where we cook for you for a change, where Emma goes to bed at her regular bedtime so we can actually talk. It was such a simple invitation, but it represented everything I had been trying to build, a relationship based on mutual care rather than one-sided service, on shared time rather than assumed availability. I'd love that, I said, and meant it completely. After I hung up, I walked through my house, turning off lights and checking locks, savoring the weight of my new keys in my palm. The trust documents were filed safely in my desk drawer, legal protection for the autonomy I had fought so hard to reclaim. The bread I had baked that morning filled the kitchen with lingering sweetness, proof that I could create beauty simply because I wanted to. Everything in my house was exactly as I had left it, exactly as I wanted it to be. No toys scattered across the living room floor, no sippy cups abandoned on coffee tables, no evidence of anyone's needs but my own. It wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. It wasn't empty, it was mine. As I got ready for bed, I thought about the woman who had closed the door on David 3 weeks ago, driven by hurt and the sudden realization that she deserved better treatment than she had been accepting. That woman had been brave in her desperation, courageous in her pain. But she had also been uncertain, untested, unsure whether she could actually build the life she was imagining. This woman, the one brushing her teeth in her own bathroom, in her own time, accountable to no one but herself, was different. She had tested her courage and found it strong enough to support new boundaries. She had risked disappointing people she loved and discovered that authentic relationships could survive disappointment, but couldn't survive disrespect. She had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to enable someone's thoughtlessness, that caring for others sometimes required caring for yourself first, that being a good mother and grandmother didn't require being an endless source of unpaid labor. Most importantly, she had discovered that dignity wasn't something you earned through service or sacrifice, it was something you claimed through choice, something you protected through boundaries, something you practiced through the daily decision to value yourself as much as you valued others. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice these lessons, new chances to choose respect over accommodation, new moments to remember that love without boundaries wasn't really love at all, it was just habit dressed up in the language of devotion. But tonight, she was enough. Her house was enough. Her choices were enough. Her life was enough. And for the first time in decades, that felt like everything. 3 months later, I stood in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning, preparing for Emma's visit with the kind of anticipation that felt entirely different from the weary obligation that had characterized our previous arrangements. She would arrive at 10, stay until 2, and leave with a container of the soup we had made together and a small potted plant we had chosen from my garden. This visit was happening because I had invited it. After all, I wanted to spend time with my granddaughter, because I had something specific and special planned for our afternoon together. It wasn't happening because her parents needed free childcare. After all, my Tuesday was assumed to be available, because my love was measured by my willingness to be convenient. The difference was profound and transformative. Sarah would drop Emma off with genuine gratitude, not the casual assumption that my time belonged to her family's schedule. David would pick her up with appreciation for the gift I was giving, not irritation that I might not be available the following week. And Emma would leave with the sense that Grandma's house was a special place where she was welcome and celebrated, not a convenience service where she was tolerated and managed. The soup we would make together, butternut squash with a touch of ginger, was Emma's current favorite, and she had specifically requested it for today's cooking project. We would peel and chop vegetables while talking about everything and nothing, singing songs, and telling stories while the soup simmered. Then we would eat it together at my kitchen table, served in real bowls with real napkins, because Emma deserved to be treated like an honored guest rather than an obligation to be fed efficiently. After lunch, we would work in the garden, planting bulbs for next spring's flowers and talking about how some beautiful things required patience and planning and faith that the future would be worth investing in. Emma was just old enough to understand that the bulbs we planted today wouldn't bloom until she was 4, that some gifts took time to reveal themselves, that tending something with care was its own kind of love. As I set out the ingredients for our soup, I reflected on how much had changed since that evening in April when I closed the door on David's dismissive words. The changes hadn't been dramatic or sudden. There had been no lightning bolt moments of transformation or tearful reconciliations that resolved everything in a single conversation. Instead, the changes had been gradual and deliberate, built one boundary at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of self-respect. David and Sarah had learned to hire actual babysitters when they needed childcare, and had discovered that paying someone for their time often came with benefits they had never considered when my help was free. Professional caregivers arrived on time, came prepared with their own supplies, and treated childcare as the skilled work it was, rather than a favor they were doing for the parents. More importantly, they had learned to value the time I chose to spend with Emma because it came from love rather than obligation. Our visits were more intentional now, more focused, filled with activities I had planned because I wanted to share them rather than ways to occupy a child until her parents returned. The trust one had established had already begun making distributions to organizations that supported elder dignity and independence. Every month, I received reports about how my money was being used to help other older adults maintain autonomy and choice in their living situations. The knowledge that my resources were actively supporting causes I believed in gave me a sense of purpose that extended far beyond my own family relationships. My friendship with Eleanor had deepened into the kind of supportive partnership that I hadn't experienced since my husband's death. We checked on each other without being intrusive, shared meals without keeping score, and celebrated each other's independence while offering practical help when it was genuinely needed. She had become both neighbor and chosen family, proof that meaningful relationships could develop at any stage of life when they were built on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. Margaret and I had resumed our regular lunch dates, and I had reconnected with other friends whose invitations I had declined for years because my schedule was too full of other people's needs. Book club, gardening society meetings, and afternoon movies, all the social activities I had given up gradually, without realizing how much I missed them until I reclaimed them. The travel I had begun with that first solo trip to the mountains had expanded into a regular practice of taking small adventures on my own schedule. Weekend trips to visit museums or botanical gardens, overnight stays at historic inns, and day trips to explore small towns I had always meant to visit. Each journey reinforced my confidence in my own company and my ability to navigate the world as a single, autonomous person rather than as someone's available grandmother. But perhaps the most significant change was internal, the way I had learned to trust my own judgment, to honor my own needs, to believe that my preferences mattered as much as anyone else's. For decades, I had measured my worth by my usefulness to others, had felt guilty for wanting things that didn't directly benefit my family, and had convinced myself that self-care was selfish and boundary setting was unkind. Now I understand that caring for myself was what enabled me to care authentically for others, that protecting my energy allowed me to offer it more generously, that insisting on respect made my love more valuable rather than less available. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock, and I opened the door to find Emma bouncing with excitement on my front porch, clutching a drawing she had made for me during the car ride. Sarah stood behind her, holding a small overnight bag with extra clothes and the special stuffed animal Emma couldn't cook without. "Grandma, I drew you a picture of our soup. It's beautiful, sweetheart. Should we hang it on the refrigerator before we start cooking?" "Yes. And I want to use the step stool, and I want to stir everything, and I want to taste it a million times." Sarah laughed, but it was a relaxed laugh, free of the tension that had characterized our interactions when she viewed me as a service provider rather than a willing participant in Emma's life. "She's been talking about making soup with you since we confirmed the visit yesterday." "We're going to have a wonderful time," I assured her, taking Emma's hand. "What time should we expect you?" Is 2 o'clock still good? I don't want to impose on your afternoon. 2 is perfect. Emma and I will be ready to show you what we've accomplished. After Sarah left, Emma and I settled into the rhythm of cooking together, the kind of slow, purposeful activity that had become the hallmark of our visits. She stood on her special step stool at my kitchen counter, carefully peeling carrots with the child-safe peeler I had bought just for her, narrating her work with the serious concentration of someone engaged in important business. "This carrot is going to make our soup orange," she announced. "And the squash is going to make it sweet. And the ginger is going to make it spicy, but good spicy, not bad spicy." "That's exactly right. You're becoming quite the chef." We worked side by side for nearly an hour, chopping vegetables and discussing everything from why onions made us cry to whether soup tasted better when you made it yourself. Emma asked questions about cooking and life with the directness that only 3-year-olds possessed, and I answered them with the patience that came from having time and attention to offer rather than tasks to rush through. When the soup was simmering and filling my kitchen with the scent of caramelized vegetables and warming spices, we moved to the garden to plant tulip bulbs for next spring. Emma carefully placed each bulb in its hole, covering it with soil and patting it down gently while I explained how the cold winter would help the flowers grow strong enough to bloom when the weather warmed. "So they're sleeping underground all winter?" she asked, brushing soil from her small hands. "Exactly. They're resting and getting ready for spring. Like how I rest at night and get ready for tomorrow? Just like that. Sometimes the best things happen when we're patient and let them grow at their own pace." By the time we sat down to eat our soup, Emma was glowing with the pride of accomplishment and the joy of being completely present with someone who was completely present with her. We ate slowly, tasting and appreciating what we had created together, talking about the garden and the soup and the drawings she wanted to make next. When Sarah returned at 2, she found us cleaning up the kitchen together, Emma standing on her step stool washing spoons while I dried them and put them away. The container of leftover soup sat waiting on the counter along with a small pot containing the viola seedling Emma had chosen from my greenhouse. "How did it go?" Sarah asked, but she could see the answer in Emma's bright face and relaxed posture. "We made the best soup in the world," Emma announced. "And we planted flowers for when I'm 4. And Grandma let me stir everything." Sarah accepted the soup and seedling with the kind of gratitude that acknowledged both the gift and the choice behind it. "Thank you so much for this. She's been looking forward to it all week." "So have I said, meaning it completely." After they left, I sat on my front porch with a cup of tea, looking at the garden where Emma and I had planted bulbs that would bloom months from now. The marigolds from my spring planting were still flowering despite the autumn chill, their bright faces a reminder that beauty could persist even as seasons changed. Inside my house, the smell of our soup lingered in the kitchen, and Emma's drawing was prominently displayed on my refrigerator alongside the photo from our last visit and the thank you note she had dictated to Sarah the week before. These weren't the desperate accumulations of someone trying to prove her worth through grandmotherly service, but the treasured mementos of a relationship built on mutual joy and respect. The late afternoon light slanted through my windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny celebrations in the air. Everything in my house was exactly as I wanted it, tidy but not sterile, welcoming but not overwhelming, beautiful in the way that spaces become beautiful when they reflect the authentic preferences of the people who inhabit them. Tomorrow, I will drive to the mountains for another solo retreat, this time to a different inn, where I will spend 3 days reading, hiking, and practicing the art of being completely myself without explanation or apology. Next week, I will have dinner with David, Sarah, and Emma, a meal they were preparing for me in their home, where I will be a guest rather than a service provider, honored rather than assumed. The following month, Eleanor and I were planning a trip together to visit the gardens at Biltmore, 2 women of a certain age who had learned that friendship could be its own form of chosen family and that independence could be enhanced rather than threatened by companionship with someone who understood the value of autonomy. But tonight, I would simply be a woman who had learned to close doors when necessary and open them when appropriate, who had discovered that love without boundaries wasn't really love at all, and who had found that dignity was not something you earned through service but something you claimed through choice. The sun was setting behind my house, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that rivaled the marigolds in my garden. Soon, the first stars would appear, and I would go inside to prepare dinner for one, to read until I grew sleepy, and to fall asleep in my own bed in my own time according to my own preferences. But first, I wanted to savor this moment, sitting on my own porch, in my own time, accountable to no one but myself, surrounded by the evidence of a life built on respect rather than accommodation, love rather than obligation, and choice rather than assumption. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed with a soft, final click. But from where I sat, it sounded exactly like freedom. The last door I closed was the first truly open. As I finished my tea and prepared to go inside, I thought about doors in general, how they could separate or connect, how they could protect or imprison, and how the same piece of wood could represent barriers or boundaries depending on who held the key and how they chose to use it. The door I had closed on David 6 months ago had been the beginning of everything that followed, the legal documents that protected my autonomy, the financial changes that reinforced my independence, the travel that reminded me of my own company, the boundaries that transformed obligation into gift-giving. But it had also been the beginning of doors opening, to friends I had neglected, to experiences I had postponed, to parts of myself I had forgotten existed. The door to an authentic relationship with my family, built on respect rather than service. The door to community with neighbors and peers who valued independence as much as connection. The door to a future where my choices mattered as much as anyone else's. I stood up from my porch chair, brushing cookie crumbs from my lap and collecting my empty teacup. Inside my house, everything was exactly as I had left it, exactly as I wanted it to be. My space, my time, my choices, my life. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice the lessons I had learned, new chances to choose dignity over accommodation, new moments to remember that self-respect was not selfish but essential. There would be more conversations with family members who were still learning to see me as a person rather than a service, more decisions about how to spend my time, resources, and energy. But tonight, as I turned off the porch light and locked my door with keys that belonged only to me, I felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had found her way home to herself. The house settled around me with familiar creaks and sighs, wrapping me in the comfort of a space that reflected my authentic preferences rather than other people's expectations. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking another day lived on my own terms, another evening that belonged entirely to me. I walked through my house, turning off lights and checking windows, savoring the weight of responsibility for my own security and comfort. The trust documents in my desk drawer guaranteed my right to these choices. The new locks on my doors protected my ability to make them. The relationships I had rebuilt honored both my autonomy and my love. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was exactly as I had chosen it to be. And for the first time in decades, that felt like everything I had ever wanted. In my bedroom, I changed into comfortable clothes and settled into bed with a book I had been looking forward to reading, a story about other women who had learned to close some doors to open others, who had discovered that the most radical thing you could do was honor your own needs as much as you honored everyone else's. Outside my window, the night was quiet and peaceful, full of the gentle sounds that belonged to a neighborhood at rest. Inside my house, everything was mine, the silence and the solitude, the choices and the consequences, the peace and the possibility. I read until my eyes grew heavy, then set the book aside and turned off the light. In the darkness, I could hear my own breathing, steady and calm, the sound of someone who had finally learned to take up space in her own life without apologizing for it. The last door I closed was the first truly open. And through that opening, everything else became possible.